James Carter had always thought of himself as a man of principle, a defender of justice, and, most importantly, someone who could enjoy his morning coffee in peace. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as the sun bathed his suburban lawn in golden light, James realized that tranquility was a fleeting dream. The knock on his door was not the polite rap of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was the kind of knock that suggested someone had watched too many cop dramas and decided to audition for the role of intimidating law enforcer. He opened the door to find two men standing there, wearing uniforms that looked suspiciously like they'd been ordered from a discount costume website. Their badges gleamed under the sunlight, but upon closer inspection, James noticed one badge had security officer misspelled as security officer. The taller of the two, let's call him Officer Mustache, stepped forward with an air of authority so exaggerated it bordered on parody. "Mr. Carter," Officer Mustache declared, "you are hereby under arrest for violating HOA regulations." James blinked. "I'm sorry, what? You heard me?" Mustache continued, puffing out his chest. "You've broken several rules outlined in the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Specifically, your mailbox is not painted in an approved shade of beige." James stared at them, then at his mailbox. It was white, classic, clean, and utterly harmless. "You're arresting me over my mailbox?" The shorter officer, let's call him Officer Nervous, chimed in. "It's not just the mailbox. There's also the matter of your lawn ornaments." James glanced at his front yard. A single ceramic gnome stood proudly among the flower beds. "You mean Gary?" he asked incredulously. "Yes," Mustache snapped. HOA regulations clearly state that lawn decorations must be limited to 1 per 10 square feet. You're over by approximately, He turned to Nervous for help. 3 square feet, Nervous offered hesitantly. James folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Let me get this straight. You're telling me that my mailbox and Gary have caused such an egregious breach of community standards that you've sent cops to arrest me?" Mustache shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. "We're enforcing the rules." James smirked. "You're enforcing rules dressed like that?" It was at this moment that James noticed something curious. Neither officer had a gun or handcuffs, just walkie-talkies clipped to their belts and an air of desperation that screamed, "Amateur hour." He decided to play along for a moment longer. "All right," James said, feigning compliance. "Let me grab my wallet and keys before you haul me off." As he stepped back into his house, he reached for his briefcase instead. A sleek leather case containing documents that could make grown men weep. Legal statutes, HOA bylaws, and most importantly, his badge identifying him as the Attorney General of the state. When James returned to the doorway holding his credentials, he saw both officers visibly pale. He held up his badge with a flourish worthy of a courtroom drama. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Mustache stammered incoherently, while Nervous looked like he wanted to evaporate into thin air. "You see," James continued, enjoying their discomfort far more than he should have, "not only am I well-versed in HOA regulations, which, by the way, do not include provisions for arrest, but I also happen to be the highest-ranking legal authority in this state. So let me ask you, which precinct are you from?" The silence was deafening. "Ah," James said after a moment. "Not cops then? Let me guess, you're hired goons sent by Margaret Livingston." At the mention of Margaret, the iron-fisted president of the HOA, both men flinched. "Thought so," James said with a grin that could rival any villain's monologue moment. "Tell Margaret she'll be hearing from me soon." The officers mumbled incoherent apologies before retreating down the driveway faster than James thought humanly possible. As they disappeared around the corner, James turned back to Gary the gnome and patted its ceramic head. "Well, Gary," he said with mock solemnity, "looks like we've declared war on beige-loving bureaucrats." He stepped inside and poured himself another cup of coffee. Tasted better than ever, victory always did. James Carter wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to absurdity. After his morning run-in with the faux cops, he decided it was time to dig deeper into the HOA's antics. If they thought they could intimidate him with bad costumes and worse acting, they were sorely mistaken. James wasn't just any homeowner. He was the Attorney General of the state, and he had a knack for turning petty grievances into full-blown legal crusades. He started his investigation the way any seasoned lawyer would, by reading the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS. These documents were supposed to be the backbone of community harmony, but as James flipped through page after page, he realized they were more like a manifesto for suburban tyranny. The rules were so specific and absurd that he wondered if Margaret Livingston, the HOA president, had written them during a particularly spiteful wine-fueled brainstorming session. For starters, there was the infamous beige mandate, which required all mailboxes to be painted in one of 3 shades of beige, approved by the Architectural Review Committee, ARC. James chuckled at the thought of grown adults debating whether sandstorm beige or desert mirage beige was superior. Then there was the lawn ornament limitation, which dictated that homeowners could have no more than 1 decorative item per 10 square feet of lawn space. Gary the gnome was technically in violation, but James couldn't help but feel that Gary deserved better than to be outlawed by such draconian measures. The deeper James dug, the more ridiculous it got. There was a rule prohibiting holiday decorations before Thanksgiving, because apparently premature festivity was a crime against humanity. Another rule banned trampolines with blue covers on the grounds that they might confuse ducks into thinking they were ponds. And then there was the piece de resistance, a regulation forbidding pets over 15 pounds unless they were certified emotional support animals. James imagined Margaret personally weighing every neighborhood dog on a scale like some sort of suburban overlord. But it wasn't just the rules that irked him, it was how they were enforced. Margaret seemed to relish her role as HOA president in ways that bordered on villainous. She had a reputation for sending out violation letters with alarming frequency, often accompanied by fines so steep they could rival parking tickets in downtown Manhattan. Residents whispered about her penchant for hiring private security firms to patrol the neighborhood, but James now knew she had taken it a step further by employing fake cops to intimidate him. Fueled by righteous indignation and several cups of coffee, James decided to confront Margaret directly. He attended the next HOA meeting, which was held in the community clubhouse, a space designed to look welcoming but somehow managed to feel as oppressive as a courtroom. Margaret sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her loyal board members who nodded along to everything she said like bobbleheads on a dashboard. James waited patiently as Margaret droned on about budget allocations and landscaping violations. When she finally opened the floor for questions, he raised his hand with an exaggerated politeness that made her visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Carter," she said with forced cheerfulness, "what can we do for you?" "Well," James began, standing up and adjusting his tie for dramatic effect, "I'd like to discuss your recent attempt to have me arrested over my mailbox." The room fell silent except for a few gasps from residents who clearly hadn't heard about this latest escapade. Margaret's smile faltered but quickly returned in full force. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," James replied smoothly. "You sent 2 men dressed as police officers to my home last week. They claimed I was in violation of HOA regulations and threatened me with arrest." Margaret laughed nervously. "That's quite an accusation." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact," James said, pulling out his phone and playing an audio recording of Officer Mustache fumbling through his lines about beige mailboxes and lawn ornaments. Margaret's face turned several shades of red, none of them beige, and her bobblehead minions looked like they wanted to sink into their chairs. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Margaret stammered. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding," James said with a grin that could cut glass. "You've crossed several lines here, not just ethical ones but legal ones too." He proceeded to outline every violation Margaret had committed: impersonating law enforcement officers, a felony; misusing HOA funds, highly questionable; and enforcing rules that contradicted local zoning laws, a rookie mistake. By the time he finished his speech, Margaret looked like she might faint. "But let's not stop there," James continued cheerfully. "I've also reviewed your financial records, publicly accessible ones, of course, and noticed some interesting discrepancies." The room collectively leaned forward as James laid out evidence suggesting Margaret had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Lavish dinners at upscale restaurants, spa treatments billed as community wellness initiatives, and payments to contractors who just happened to be relatives. Margaret tried to interrupt him several times but failed miserably as James steamrolled through his presentation with all the finesse of a seasoned prosecutor dismantling a weak defense case. By the end of it, residents were murmuring among themselves in outrage. One elderly woman stood up and shouted, "You made me pay $200 for having pink flamingos in my yard, while you're out here getting facials on our dime?" James couldn't have scripted it better if he tried. Margaret attempted one last-ditch effort to regain control of the room. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We need more evidence before making accusations." "Oh, don't worry," James said with mock reassurance. "I've already filed a formal complaint with state authorities. They'll handle the investigation from here." The room erupted into applause as Margaret slumped back into her chair, defeated. As James left the clubhouse that evening, several neighbors approached him to thank him for standing up to Margaret's tyranny. One man even offered him free lawn care services as a token of gratitude, a gesture James politely declined but secretly appreciated. Back at home, James poured himself another cup of coffee and sat down next to Gary the gnome. James Carter knew that exposing Margaret Livingston's questionable practices at the HOA meeting was only the beginning. He'd rattled her cage, sure, but he wasn't the kind of man to leave a job half done. Margaret was still HOA president, and as long as she remained in power, her reign of beige terror would continue. James decided it was time to escalate his efforts and bring the fight directly to her doorstep, or more accurately, her meticulously landscaped front yard. The first step in James's plan was gathering more evidence. He couldn't rely solely on public outrage. He needed hard proof to ensure Margaret faced real consequences. So, armed with his legal expertise and a determination fueled by caffeine and spite, James dove into the HOA's financial records. What he found was a treasure trove of mismanagement and outright fraud. For starters, there was the Community Beautification Fund, which Margaret had claimed was being used to maintain the neighborhood's common areas. In reality, it appeared to be funding her personal beautification efforts, weekly spa treatments, designer handbags, and even a suspiciously high number of charges at a luxury pet grooming service. James couldn't help but laugh at the irony. While Margaret was pampering herself, she was fining residents for having slightly overgrown hedges. Then there were the payments to contractors. On paper, these were supposed to cover repairs and improvements to the community clubhouse. In practice, they seemed to be going to Margaret's cousin, who owned a construction company that had no website, no reviews, and no actual employees beyond himself. The clubhouse hadn't seen any renovations in years, but Margaret's cousin had recently purchased a brand new truck with HOA funds. James also discovered that Margaret had been using HOA money to host lavish dinners under the guise of board meetings. These dinners were held at upscale restaurants far outside the neighborhood and often included bottles of wine that cost more than most people's monthly utility bills. The guest list for these meetings seemed suspiciously small, usually just Margaret and one or two of her closest allies on the board. Armed with this damning evidence, James decided it was time for Phase 2, public humiliation. He knew that taking Margaret down wouldn't just require legal action. It would also require turning the tide of public opinion against her completely. And what better way to do that than by exposing her hypocrisy in front of the very people she claimed to represent? James organized a neighborhood gathering under the pretense of discussing community improvements. He rented out the clubhouse, using his own money, since he didn't trust Margaret not to siphon off funds for another spa day, and invited every homeowner in the neighborhood. The turnout was impressive. It seemed that word had spread about James's confrontation with Margaret at the last HOA meeting, and people were eager to see what he had planned next. When everyone had settled in, James took the stage with a stack of documents in hand and a projector set up behind him. He began his presentation with a slide titled, "Where Your HOA Fees Really Go." The first image was a receipt from an exclusive spa downtown, followed by photos of designer handbags purchased on HOA credit cards. The audience gasped and murmured as James explained each expense in detail. Next came the payments to Margaret's cousin's construction company. James showed pictures of the clubhouse, unchanged and slightly dilapidated, and contrasted them with photos of the shiny new truck parked in front of Margaret's cousin's house. "I don't know about you," James said with mock seriousness, "but I don't remember voting for truck beautification as part of our community improvement plan." The piece de resistance was a series of receipts from high-end restaurants where Margaret had hosted her so-called board meetings. James read aloud some of the menu items purchased: lobster risotto, filet mignon, and bottles of wine priced at $300 each. "Meanwhile," he added with a smirk, "Margaret fined Mrs. Henderson $150 last month for having pink flamingos in her yard because they weren't aesthetically pleasing." By the time James finished his presentation, the audience was practically foaming at the mouth with anger. Residents shouted questions like, "How is this legal?" and "Can we vote her out?" James calmly explained that while Margaret's actions were unethical and possibly criminal, the HOA bylaws made it difficult to remove her without significant effort. "But," he added with a sly grin, "I've already filed complaints with both state authorities and federal agencies regarding misuse of funds and impersonation of law enforcement officers. So while we work on removing her from power here, rest assured that she'll be answering for her actions elsewhere." The crowd erupted into applause. Several residents approached James afterward to thank him for standing up to Margaret and exposing her corruption. One elderly man even offered him homemade cookies as a token of appreciation, a gesture James graciously accepted because who could say no to cookies? Margaret herself didn't attend the gathering. She'd likely heard about it beforehand and decided discretion was the better part of valor. But James knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. Sure enough, within days of his presentation, she began sending out violation notices en masse, targeting anyone who had attended the meeting or expressed support for James. James wasn't fazed by this petty retaliation. If anything, it only strengthened his resolve. He encouraged residents to ignore the fines and assured them that they were unenforceable under state law. Meanwhile, he continued working behind the scenes to ensure Margaret faced legal consequences for her actions. One particularly satisfying moment came when state investigators showed up at Margaret's house with subpoenas for financial records. Neighbors watched from their windows as Margaret tried and failed to talk her way out of handing over documents. Word spread quickly through the community, and soon everyone knew that justice was finally catching up with their tyrannical HOA president. As James sat on his porch one evening sipping coffee, his preferred beverage during moments of triumph, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He'd come to this neighborhood looking for peace and quiet, but had found himself embroiled in suburban warfare instead. And while it wasn't exactly what he'd signed up for, there was something deeply rewarding about standing up for his neighbors and taking down someone who thought they were untouchable. Gary the gnome stood proudly in his flower bed nearby, a silent witness to all that had transpired. James raised his coffee mug in salute. "To justice," he said aloud, "and to lawn ornaments everywhere." James Carter didn't consider himself a vindictive man. He preferred to think of himself as a firm believer in accountability. And if that accountability happened to come with a side of public humiliation for Margaret Livingston, well, who was he to argue with fate? After all, she'd brought this on herself. You don't send fake cops to arrest the Attorney General over a mailbox and expect to walk away unscathed. The fallout from James's neighborhood presentation had been swift and glorious. Margaret's carefully curated image as the benevolent dictator of the HOA had crumbled faster than a poorly constructed sandcastle at high tide. Residents who had once cowered under her reign of beige tyranny were now emboldened, openly questioning her every decision and demanding transparency in HOA operations. Margaret, for her part, responded by doubling down on her authoritarian tactics, sending out even more violation notices and threatening legal action against anyone who dared defy her. But Margaret's threats were about as effective as a wet paper towel trying to stop a flood. James had already filed formal complaints with state and federal authorities, and the wheels of justice were turning. Investigators were combing through the HOA's financial records with the enthusiasm of bloodhounds on a scent trail, and Margaret's increasingly frantic attempts to cover her tracks only made her look guiltier. Then came the day James had been waiting for, the special HOA meeting to vote on Margaret's removal as president. It was a rare event, requiring a supermajority of homeowners to attend and cast their votes. James had spent weeks rallying his neighbors, going door to door with copies of his evidence and explaining why Margaret needed to go. He'd even managed to convince the notoriously reclusive Mr. Thompson from down the street, a man who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in 15 years, to show up and vote. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, which was packed to capacity. Residents filled every chair, leaned against walls, and spilled out into the hallway. There was an electric buzz in the air, a mix of anticipation and schadenfreude. Margaret sat at the head of the table, flanked by her remaining loyalists on the board. She looked calm on the surface, but James could see the cracks in her facade. The clenched jaw, the tapping fingers, the way she avoided making eye contact with anyone. James took his seat near the front, leaning back casually as if he were watching a particularly entertaining episode of reality TV. The meeting began with Margaret attempting to defend herself against the allegations. She claimed that all expenditures had been approved by the board, a half-truth at best, and that any discrepancies in financial records were simply clerical errors. She even tried to paint herself as a victim, accusing James of orchestrating a smear campaign against her. James let her talk. He let her dig herself deeper into a hole with every word she said. And when it was finally his turn to speak, he stood up with all the gravitas of a seasoned prosecutor addressing a jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'd like to start by saying that this isn't personal. I have nothing against Margaret Livingston as an individual, but as president of this HOA, she has abused her power, misused community funds, and violated both ethical standards and state laws." He proceeded to lay out his case with surgical precision, presenting evidence that left no room for doubt. He showed receipts for spa treatments and designer handbags purchased with HOA money. He displayed photos of Margaret's cousin's shiny new truck alongside invoices for clubhouse repairs that had never been completed. He even played an audio recording of one of Margaret's hired goons admitting that they'd been instructed to impersonate police officers. By the time James finished his presentation, there wasn't a single sympathetic face left in the room, not even among Margaret's loyalists on the board. "I think we've heard enough," said Mrs. Henderson, who had become something of a local hero after standing up to Margaret at James's earlier presentation. "Let's vote." The ballots were distributed and collected quickly, and within minutes, the results were announced. Margaret Livingston was officially removed as president of the HOA by an overwhelming majority. The room erupted into cheers and applause. Some residents hugged each other. Others high-fived James as he made his way toward the exit. Even Mr. Thompson cracked a rare smile before retreating back into his hermit-like existence. Margaret, meanwhile, sat frozen at the head of the table, her face pale and expressionless. For once in her life, she seemed at a loss for words. But James wasn't done yet. As he reached the door, he turned back to address the crowd one last time. "Before I go," he said with a grin that could rival Gary the Gnome's smugness, "I'd like to remind everyone that justice doesn't end here. Margaret will still have to answer for her actions in court, and I'll personally make sure she does." The applause grew even louder as James walked out into the night feeling like some kind of suburban superhero. In the weeks that followed, things began to change for the better in the neighborhood. A new HOA president was elected, a kind-hearted retired teacher named Mrs. Whitaker who actually cared about fostering community rather than enforcing arbitrary rules about mailbox colors. The ridiculous fines stopped coming. Residents were allowed to decorate their lawns as they pleased, and Gary the Gnome became something of a local mascot. As for Margaret, she faced multiple charges ranging from embezzlement to impersonating law enforcement officers. Her trial became something of a local spectacle, with residents showing up in droves to watch justice being served. James attended every session, not because he needed closure, but because he found it endlessly satisfying to see Margaret squirm under cross-examination. And so life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when your neighborhood had just survived an HOA dictatorship. James finally got to enjoy his morning coffee in peace. Most days. One morning, while sipping his brew on his porch next to Gary, he noticed Mrs. Henderson walking by with 2 pink flamingos tucked under her arm. "Morning," she called out cheerfully. "Morning," James replied with a grin. "Nice flamingos." "Thanks," she said proudly. Figured it was time they made their comeback. James raised his mug in salute as she walked away. "To freedom," he said aloud. "To no one in particular, but also maybe to Gary." And lawn ornaments everywhere.